Hey, it's Dr. Jaime, and let's talk about the importance of salt and electrolytes. If you're living the low-carb life like me, your requirements are actually much higher. And there's only one source that we trust in our home, and it's the people and products at Redmond Real Salt. They keep us coming back for more every time. Real salt's an all-natural, unrefined sea salt harvested from an ancient ocean. It's full of natural minerals that make it healthy, delicious, and pink or red looking. They're also the best-selling brand in America's health and food stores. Redmond Real Salt is so pure, it's free of pollutants and microplastics found in many other natural refined salts. The Redmond Salt Deposit is in Redmond, Utah, where the team enjoys award-winning work conditions and generous pay. And since they own and control the whole process, you can be sure that Real Salt comes to you through their world-class production facilities in its unrefined, mineral-rich, delicious state, exactly as nature intended. Redmond has amazing natural products including salt, electrolytes, toothpaste, and so much more. So check out the entire line at www.redmond.life, where you can use my code DRFIT, that's DRFIT, for a discount on all Redmond Real Salt and Relight products. Welcome to the Fit and Fabulous podcast with Dr. Jaime Seaman. Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Jaime, and welcome back to the Fit and Fabulous podcast. It's so lovely to have you here today. And I just want to thank you if you've been listening to our previous episodes, every person that likes, downloads, comments them. Thank you. It helps us so much. Well, I have an amazing guest on the show today. I've been really looking forward to recording with him for a while now, because what he does is a topic that I get asked about a lot, and I'm a gynecologist. This is not my area of expertise. And so I want to welcome Dave Feldman to the Fit and Fabulous podcast. Dave, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
For anybody that doesn't know who Dave is, he's a senior software engineer that actually turned citizen scientist. After he saw his cholesterol levels skyrocket on a ketogenic diet, he began obsessively researching lipidology, and through a series of experiments, he was able to demonstrate unprecedented data, which is now building toward a larger lipid energy model. This concept is being explored with collaborating researchers and may potentially help explain much of the phenomenon around cholesterol on low carb and ketogenic diets. So it's a very interesting story, Dave. I'm interested to know how you're a senior software engineer. Tell us this transition, like why did you eat a ketogenic diet? Like how did we end up here?
Well, it actually all started when I got, as with many people who decide to go low carb, I got markers suggesting I was on my way to diabetes. I had an A1C of 6.1 a couple years in a row, and they kept saying they'll quote unquote monitor it. And I was like, well, I don't want to monitor it. I actually want to dodge it because my dad's side of the family is rampant with type 2 diabetes. And so I started looking around, and this was in 2015. Keto hadn't yet gotten as big as it is now. So there was, however, LCHF, low carb, high fat. And I found on diabetes forums that this was regularly, considered to be an effective way to help reduce your A1C. And so I started going on it, felt great. My dad and my sister got inspired to do it around the same time. And they saw their cholesterol levels not go up too much. Me, on the other hand, I saw my cholesterols go up substantially 7 months later. And as an engineer, I became very obsessed and started trying to learn everything I could about lipidology, the study of lipids, and why cholesterol changes. And as it turns out, and as I'd contend to this day, it's because of something I'm already somewhat familiar with in software, which is it looks a lot like a network. It's actually a very complex system that moves these lipids around in our body, including cholesterol, that can help, I think, explain why when you're powered by fat, you would actually see these changes.
Fascinating. So now your full-time work is basically working on studies and furthering the knowledge base surrounding lipids and low-carb diets, right?
Yeah, basically from that point that I just mentioned, I started off by just doing a lot of experiments of my own and found I could change my cholesterol levels, like moving them up and down, literally in a matter of hours to days, and was presenting this data. And as my research kind of caught a lot more traction with the low carb community, you're exactly right. I started kind of staking out a bit more of a role. And I'm very thankful because we're in the day and age of social media where actually it can be used for good purposes, such as data sharing and collaboration. And because of that, that's how I've managed to connect with a lot of the people I'm collaborating with right now on both the lipid energy model and our coming study out of Lundquist, which is studying folks like myself who have very high LDL, but also what the risk stratification is, because we're also capturing plaque progression and so forth.
Yeah, so cholesterol has definitely been controversial over the years when it comes to nutrition research, that includes saturated fat and cholesterol, and really the cholesterol heart hypothesis that it is, LDL cholesterol that drives atherosclerosis and risk of heart disease. So explain to people what happens to your lipids or your cholesterol on a ketogenic or low carb diet. What do we see, like in a general sense? And then we'll kind of dive into what happened to you and what happened to me, and how we actually all respond a little bit differently.
Well, yes, this is where it does get a bit interesting, because much of the existing literature before this point in time focused a lot on how LDL had an association with atherosclerosis, as you mentioned, which is the buildup of plaque in the arteries. And for what it's worth, there is an association. And there's some very interesting work going back to Brown and Goldstein looking at those who have the genetic abnormalities that would result in high LDL. And that too presented a very powerful story that indeed this may just be independently causal. But where the lipid energy model is, you mentioned, is kind of central to my research, comes into play, is exactly what we're talking about now, which is if you go low carb, you are taking it upon yourself to be powered more by fat. Well, fat is different than glucose in your bloodstream. Glucose, like sugar, which you could add to water right now, it's soluble, so it'll mix well with water. Well, your blood is water-based. If you mix fat with water, just like oil and water, you're going to find that it doesn't mix very well. So your body actually has a fairly complex shipping system, let's call it, for shipping these fats around in your body. And we're not talking just cholesterol, but again, if you're powered by fat, this means fatty acids. You're literally utilizing fatty acids in the periphery, in your surrounding tissues. And so there needs to be these proteins that your body makes to carry those fatty acids around. And one of those is a very famous protein, which is ApoB, short for apolipoprotein B, and it's found on LDL. And I'm sure you've heard of LDL before. LDL particles, of course, are one of these boats that carries them around, and ApoB is kind of its major carrier protein to help bring it through. But the thing is, it doesn't just bring the fat you're powered by, it also brings cholesterol. And so when you pick up that there's cholesterol levels that are higher on these ApoB containing lipoproteins, these kind of submarines, if you will, that are shipping around the fats, I contend that you can't be too surprised, because being powered by fat means you're going to need more carrier proteins to move them around. And again, that's only just two of the lipids. As I'm sure you're aware, there are many fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. There are many other lipids that we're still finding out about as well that are very interesting, but yet also very important for our cells to be able to get a hold of.
Okay, so let's talk about like a standard lipid panel. Somebody goes to their doctor's office, they get a 12-hour fasted standard lipid panel. Let's just break it down in really simple terms what people are looking at. So total cholesterol, what does that mean to somebody? Total cholesterol, does it mean anything?
It does. I mean, effectively, it's the first thing they were looking at before they knew how to stratify them out to different things. Total cholesterol, it's usually in a unit of volume. For us in the US, it's milligrams per deciliter. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to assess all cholesterol found in those boats I was just talking about, those lipoproteins. Think of lipoprotein as short for lipid carrying protein. So all of these submarines, as it were, if you were to just pull out of all of them their cholesterol cargo and put them into a bucket, that would be your total cholesterol. And to just kind of expand on that, because it then follows, you could then separate them further into LDL cholesterol. And that would just be the cholesterol in those boats that are low density lipoproteins, which are LDL. And those boats that are high density lipoproteins, which are HDL. So usually when you hear LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol, people think it's a kind of cholesterol. Not actually true. It's really all the same cholesterol. It's just where they're found, whether they're found in the LDL boats or whether they're found in the HDL boats. But I should mention there is kind of one other cholesterol amount that's found outside of those two, which is remnant cholesterol. In other words, if you subtract from total cholesterol LDL and HDL, you have what's left in what's known as remnant cholesterol. And if what you find is that there are a lot of these remnants, and that includes some things we don't necessarily have to get into, but VLDL, IDL, et cetera, they tend to associate the most with cardiovascular disease. And we would argue, per the model, that's because there's a problem with the shipping. There's a failure to deliver lipids, whether or not you're on a low carb diet or not.
Okay. So I have my labs here, and maybe you can tell people, what happened with yours, but previous to my initiation of low carb ketogenic diet, I was a pre-diabetic. My total cholesterol was just a little bit over 200. And then through the years of checking it, it went to 193, 177, and now my total cholesterol is 168. So my cholesterol came down on a ketogenic diet. Is that typical for total cholesterol?
As I'll bet you know, it's not typical. And it actually led to one of our more entertaining first conversations, because of course we met face-to-face at Metabolic Health Summit. And I had a standing request then that I'll have now, which is that I think I know why your cholesterol levels are lower, which I'll get into real quick, which is that for those people who are doing resistance training, especially if they're doing a lot of muscle building, a lot of lifting and so forth, I believe that there's a degree for which these lipoproteins are taken up by muscle tissue for both growth and repair. And this is why we tend to find those people going on a low carb diet who are especially intensive athletes. I don't know, would Dr. Fit and Fabulous fit into this category perhaps, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think so.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I'm not a professional. I work very hard in the gym, but I mean, I think I'm kind of, like I don't want to say average Joe, but I don't compete. Like, I'm not a CrossFitter. I don't, compete professionally, but I do resistance training,
right,
at least 4 times a week.
Right, exactly. And I find this very often with lean mass hyperresponders. They'll be like, no, I don't even run that much. I mean, I don't know, maybe like 20 or 30 miles a week at the most. Often it's because you're comparing yourself to other people who who are total beasts. It's always the level above, right? But I'm looking behind you in your camera, and I'm seeing a gal with bars, because that's some of the images I've seen of you online, right? So for sure you have built into your routine something that I would argue would likely result in greater, it's called endocytosis, as in it's almost literally cells consuming lipoproteins. Why? Because those lipoproteins, those boats, they're made of, their surface area is made of phospholipids and free cholesterol. You need to know what that is, but you do need to know that the cells themselves are made of bilayers that are also phospholipids and free cholesterol. So how handy is it that if you could think of a cell as a house, and you're intentionally like smashing apart things and ripping things up, that there's like a Home Depot constantly driving past you, right? Like a portable Home Depot, and they're like, hey, we've got lots of extra supplies. You could just reach out and grab it. That's what I would argue is part, not entirely, but part of what could explain why a lot of people do resistance training on a ketogenic diet, or even not on a ketogenic diet, on any diet, will see their cholesterol levels tend to go down, because you need more cell membranes to help repair existing cells, or for that matter, to grow new ones.
Okay. What happened with your total cholesterol?
Yes, it shot through the roof. So I brought up my dad and my sister had got inspired to do the same diet at the same time. There was a difference between us, which is that, and they would agree with this, I'm a bit more metabolically healthy than they are, and I'm leaner than they are. And that became kind of part of the basis as to why I was so curious as to how this happened, because I thought it was predominantly genetic. A lot of people think that it's predominantly genetic, but the lipid energy model that we're working on suggests otherwise. So I saw my cholesterol, I saw my total cholesterol. I think it went from somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to maybe like 350, something in that neighborhood. And my LDL cholesterol had gone from, it was typically 120 to 130 up to maybe 230, 240. So naturally, I was very concerned, as of course the guidelines would suggest that your LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, should be at 100 milligrams per deciliter or lower. And that's why I became obsessed with trying to figure out more as to why this is happening.
Yeah. So my total cholesterol went down and my LDL went down. It was previously 121 when I had prediabetes, and today it's 95. So different than what happened with you, Dave, but I definitely get patients in my clinic who adopt this type of diet. Cholesterol goes up, LDL goes up, and their doctor is immediately concerned for risk of a cardiovascular event and recommends, statin therapy. That's kind of like what I'm seeing day in and day out. But there's other parts of the lipid panel that maybe we're not paying attention to, which are your triglycerides and your HDL, and they definitely change on low carb diets. So my triglycerides went from about 150, which is the upper limit of normal, down to 47 now. And then my HDL cholesterol was 51, and now it's up to 69. So an improvement in HDL cholesterol, reduction in triglycerides. So that ratio has improved drastically. Is that typical for most people?
I don't know if I could say for sure typical for most people, because as is often the case, somebody could be watching this and being like, oh, this was different for me in particular.
That wasn't me. Yeah.
Yeah. But I will say that at least from my own observations, this is commonly the case. And from the literature, that does seem to be the case. But in particular, getting back to this, thinking about this in terms of shipping, right? Per our model, what we're suggesting is that actually it can encompass the reasoning for all three of these. Why LDL would go up in somebody who you would consider to be more metabolically healthy. Well, it's actually because it's a downstream result of more of these carrier proteins, these ApoB carrier proteins having to come in to provide those fatty acids that you're making use of. Well, what's fascinating about this is mediated and in the periphery by this turnover. And in other words, these boats are constantly dropping off their cargo. There's more of the empty boats left over, as it were. They started bloated with triglycerides, the storage form of fat. And now they're mainly LDL particles. And that's why there's just more of them in general, because there's more of the shipping process. But likewise, on top of that, there's what receives a lot of their pieces. So beyond the phospholipids and free cholesterol that your cells might take up, there's actually a whole fleet called HDL, which of course we're used to being associated with the quote unquote good cholesterol. The reason it having higher levels tends to associate with lower cardiovascular disease risk, we would argue, is probably because it suggests more successful shipping. In other words, more of the fatty acids are succeeding to get there, because more of what happens when these larger ApoB particles, these VLDL, remodel to LDL, you can almost think of them as their job is to start big, bloated with all these lipids, and to get small. Well, HDL, its job is to start small. You may already know at least this much with lipidology. HDLs, they start very nascent, they start very empty, but they get bigger and bigger. Well, part of how they're getting bigger and bigger, they used to think was entirely from getting cholesterol out of tissues.
Like scavenging, like filling their ego.
Yes, and to be sure, there is some degree of that, but a large proportion, if not most of it, is actually happening in the bloodstream as these VLDL are remodeling to LDL. They're shedding their phospholipids and free cholesterol, their surface area. And that's being picked up by HDL and growing the HDL. And therefore, they not only are growing on the outside, they're growing on the inside with more cholesterol. And so there's more of that cargo moving from one side to the other. The triglycerides are the fuel. They're the fuel that you're supposed to be delivering. And whether or not, again, you're on a low carb diet or a high carb diet, your triglycerides being higher is a sign potentially of poor shipping, because it's cargo sitting around. Imagine boats sitting in a harbor and they're having trouble getting through and going where they need to go to drop off that cargo. And that's why you tend to find these two in parallel and opposing each other. Typically, the lower triglycerides are, the higher HDL is. And I'm sure you see this in your patients quite a bit, especially the super athletic ones. They'll tend to have very low triglycerides, very high HDL. Well, what I'm imagining from a systemic standpoint is, what are we seeing? We're seeing a lot of trafficking, a lot of these boats coming out with a whole lot of triglyceride cargo, but the triglyceride cargo, I mean, almost as fast as they're getting into the bloodstream, into circulation, they're getting relieved of that cargo because they have a lot of tissue in the periphery that's taking it and turning it over. These are all, by the way, things we're going to be testing quite directly through a number of different experiments to come. But it's why we think that this won't just have implications with low carb diets, but with just lipid metabolism overall. It helps to explain why this could be a strong sign of better cardiovascular health, because it's less likely that you're hyperinsulinemic. It's less likely that you're going to show many of the broken aspects associated with metabolic syndrome.
So we talked about this improvement in reduction in triglycerides, increase in the HDL. Is there a danger of having too low of triglycerides? I've seen like with triglyceride to HDL ratio, like say if the triglycerides are above 40 at least, like what's the danger of having too low?
I'm very interested to know what mechanism can be proposed for where triglycerides can be too low if ultimately a result of something metabolic. So let me give you an example. I've once had my triglycerides down to 27. And this was by design, in that what I wanted to do was I wanted to intentionally take lipids along with other wide spectrum blood tests following half marathons and full marathons, because I posited, and the data seems to back this up, that indeed, if you think of things in the way that I just described them, what would I expect to see in the aftermath of an enormous event for which I am absolutely drawing the most on the fatty acid reserves that I have, not just in my fat cells, but also from circulation itself? Well, I would expect greater demand on a per particle basis for the existing cargo. And indeed, that's how I ended up with the lowest amount, with the 27 milligrams per deciliter. But that wasn't indicative of what my triglycerides typically are. My triglycerides are probably closer to, 50 or 60, maybe even 70 in my normal day-to-day life. So it does seem to be contextual to what was going on at that time. Well, I'm sure some other version of me that doesn't have to spend all this time doing the research that I do and is out there and is running more, because I don't do running like I used to 5 years ago, might see a lot of these lower triglyceride levels, but I would think that they're more contextual. I don't think that it's pathological. I think it's physiological.
So earlier you were kind of describing how these, LDL, HDL are shrinking or growing or getting bigger or getting smaller. So you can get more advanced lipid panels, NMR panels that look at the size of these different things. And, I've heard people discuss that on low carb and ketogenic diets that the, LDL gets quote unquote bigger and fluffier, and less of like the small dense and more of like the bigger fluffier, a type A versus a type B cholesterol pattern. Can you describe what that means to the average person? That what difference does it make if the LDL are bigger versus smaller?
Yeah, so what it's often referred to is pattern A versus pattern B. Pattern A is, I forget the cut points, but I want to say it's if in the overall, if the mean average of all LDL particle size is, I want to say something like 22 nanometers.
21 point something or 22.
Something like that and above, then it's considered pattern A. Whereas below it's considered pattern B. And pattern A is associated with lower cardiovascular risk. Pattern B is associated with higher cardiovascular risk. But, and I say this delicately because I know it's somewhat controversial. And I want to give, I want to do the due diligence of emphasizing we don't know what we don't know. But I have and continue to think about this systemically, which is to say, I think because there's such a focus on trying to find the quote unquote troublemaker, which version of LDL particle is the true atherogenic particle? Is it the small dense? Is it the glycated? Is it the oxidated, et cetera? I think we're still, I just want to put on the table, I think we keep looking at things in the opposite of how we should. Rather, these are downstream patterns that are indicative of the systemic problem. We're looking at something that's causing both atherosclerosis and certain lipid profiles. And that's why these lipid profiles, you can try to kind of sort through them. But unfortunately, without greater specificity and looking at them from a systemic standpoint, you're going to keep running into this problem. So let me give you a great example, I think, that kind of illustrates something known as Simpson's paradox. BMI. I can tell you right now, with a lot of confidence, that BMI associates with type 2 diabetes. And I'm going to be right? If I grab 10,000 Americans at random, I'll bet you wouldn't be surprised if we found that there was indeed an association between BMI and type 2 diabetes, also with atherosclerosis. But you, I'm sure, would very quickly say, now, wait a sec, we should at least make a distinction between body fat percentage versus, and I'd be like, no. We have multiple lines of evidence, right? For that matter, if you have a genetic abnormality that results in higher BMI, that also associates with more cardiovascular disease. You wouldn't be surprised by that either, right? So we have genetic, and by the way, I have some studies where we took people with high BMI and we did an intervention that reduced their BMI, and that reduced their likelihood of diabetes compared to those who had higher BMI. Again, all of these things, you're like, yes, but you're still not at least making the distinction between people who might have a higher BMI for what might be healthy reasons, right? So what we're doing is we're trying to establish the true directionality of causality. If we know what we can be looking for, then that's exactly what we should examine. And what I'm saying is, let's start first with people who we can feel more confident are metabolically healthy, and then look at high LDL, high ApoB, or for that matter, even pattern A or pattern B, as you were just describing. All of these things, but the odds are, if we bring up HDL, we bring down triglycerides, if we're looking at those folks, they're probably going to have pattern A. But I don't think it's because the pattern A is of a lower cardiovascular disease risk. I think it's the metabolic health that's a lower cardiovascular disease risk that results in pattern A, as well as many of these other aspects that we see in these lipid profiles.
Chicken or the egg, kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So if we get this advanced lipid panel that's looking at the sizes, we're looking at pattern A, pattern B. Another thing that's starting to come into the conversation is ApoA and ApoB and the ratios of these. And actually, when I was getting ready for this podcast, I found it was more of an opinion piece, but basically it was like the debate is settled. ApoB is a better marker than LDL. Tell people what ApoA and ApoB are and what role they play.
Well, I'm glad, because I was able to tease from earlier in this podcast exactly where we're going, right? So it is absolutely true that ApoB will have a higher association with cardiovascular disease than just looking at LDL itself. So let's take a step back real quick to kind of break this out. So the ApoB lineage is the things I was just talking about before, the VLDL. Those are the ones that are coming from the liver, for example, that are triglyceride rich. And if they're successful in dropping off their cargo quickly, they remodel to LDL. But they all have an ApoB protein associated with it. Like I said, think of that as just sort of the central carrying protein. Now, that ApoB will have the higher association because it includes this margin of the remnants I was just talking about before. So imagine, for example, that you and I, we may have right now about, let's say, 1,000, just throwing out numbers. Let's say that we have 1,000 LDL particles. And of those, 10% are remnants, as in their VLDL, and the remaining 90% are LDL, right? And we find that association is not going to be highly associated with atherosclerosis, but we have just this slight change where we add another 10% of remnants. So that now we have an additional 100. And that does associate more with atherosclerosis. Now, is it because those additional 100 are just that much more atherosclerotic? Or is it reflected that there's twice as, sorry, I probably could have articulated this a little bit better. Is it more indicative of failure to deliver the triglycerides, which resulted in more of the remnants, which is part of why it is that those remnants have a higher association with atherosclerosis in general? In other words, if you look at ApoB minus LDL particles, and including the LDL cholesterol, what do you have left? You have remnants. Is that margin of ApoB more associated with atherosclerosis than all the other LDL? I would argue the data is very unequivocal on this. It absolutely is. So in a roundabout way, looking at ApoB, lumping in both remnants and LDL kind of puts us in an awkward place, because we're now back to Simpson's paradox again. We're now looking at kind of like BMI without making a distinction between those people who are metabolically healthy and those people who aren't. Those people who are metabolically unhealthy, they're going to have higher remnants. They will probably have marginally higher ApoB. Why? Because they also are having more of these ships that are going out there with the cargo that they are failing to deliver, that are remaining in circulation for a longer period of time. Hopefully I recovered that pretty well, but that's kind of the key. Is ApoB is sort of looking at the whole lineage altogether, but that's less specific. And it's again, getting us away from greater specificity to better understand this problem.
Tell people what you mean when you say in the context of like, if they're metabolically healthy. Does that mean normal glucose and insulin? What does that mean? If someone's like, and I don't know, am I metabolically healthy?
I know, and I realize this term is thrown around a lot, but here's how I describe metabolically healthy. Metabolism is the mix between anabolism, the building up of things, and catabolism, the breaking down of things. And there's nowhere where we use this more than with fuel that we're powered by, right? So when I think of metabolically healthy, I think of people who their bodies are successful at both putting energy away and taking energy out. That's really it in a nutshell. And so when you look at things like metabolic syndrome, what you find is that they tend to have low HDL, high triglycerides, but also a lot of other things we're used to seeing, such as high glucose, such as high insulin. There seems to be a problem with their being able to put fuel away and for them to be able to take it back out and just generally to use it. There seems to be, that's how I think of metabolically unhealthy. If on the other hand, your insulin is low, your glucose is stable, right? Your triglycerides are low. Regardless of what fatty acids are in your bloodstream, your triglycerides are low, suggesting the storage form of fat is being successfully delivered a lot. And your HDL is high, odds are you are metabolically healthy, just exactly in the way that I described it. Because this, you'll find, goes across all these different populations, regardless of ethnicity or age, et cetera. You tend to find these things correlate. Again, as an engineer, I'm like, that's because the machine is running and the way it was designed.
And this is what I find clinically, is that a patient will come in, they have had this abnormal, what is considered to be abnormal response, right, by their primary care. Your LDL is high, you need to consider statin use. So they come to me, we check all these other markers, and we discover that they are, quote unquote, metabolically healthy. And so then we have to decide, what to do with this cholesterol information. And, I've gone to the extent of looking at CAC scans, coronary artery calcium, comes back at a 0, carotid interval thickness, and I can't find, disease in these patients. So that's a lot of the work that Dave is doing, you guys, is he is kind of now claimed this idea that there's a phenotype called lean mass hyperresponder. So describe to us what lean mass hyperresponder means, like who qualifies for that based on kind of what you know.
Yeah, so it was really an observation. I mean, truly just pattern recognition, going back to when I wrote about it for the first time in 2017. And we now have some papers published on it literally from this year. So you could just do a search for lean mass hyperresponder at PubMed, you'll probably find our papers. We even have a case study that we just released on somebody who their LDL was in the 500s. And likewise, we did a CT angiogram on them. They'd they had been at these levels for 2.5 years, but it was entirely clear. And to be sure, I'll throw in the additional qualifier, which is, we don't know what we don't know. It's why we need prospective data like we're getting from the Lundquist study. But the cut points, as described in 2017 from the observations, I just sort of set them at an LDL cholesterol of 200 or higher, an HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, at 80 and above, and triglycerides of 70 or below. And all those three in combination comprise a lean mass hyperresponder. The leanness was really more observational on my part. In other words, you could send me those lab values and I could guess that you're probably lean and most likely fit. And 90% of the time, that's true. That's exactly what it turns out to be. It's typically somebody on a very low carb diet who is very lean, very athletic. And if you've worked with a lot of carnivore dieters, they're very, very, very low carb. They have a very high likelihood, the more metabolically healthy they are, to exhibit this exact phenotype, especially if they're very lean. And it's crucial on many different fronts. For one, it's part of what gave us a lot of the basis to work toward this lipid energy model, because you really kind of needed this example in mass to help us see it everywhere across all of these different demographics. But on top of that, it provided this means by which for us to look at exactly what I was describing before. Virtually all of our literature, virtually all of the studies around the association of LDL and cardiovascular disease come from populations that are either entirely or partially involving those who have some sort of dysfunction in lipid metabolism, either a disease they're born with, such as homozygous FH, or one that they've acquired through various metabolic disease states. Well, why not intentionally go and look at those folks who we believe to be metabolically healthy, but who have extraordinarily high LDL and for that matter, ApoB, right? And that's what this study is about. This is where lean mass hyperresponders, I believe, are going to teach us a lot of new things. I think it's going to be obviously I'm a bit biased, but I think it's going to be a new chapter in science for us on just at least this front.
So there's other people that can have high cholesterol, high triglycerides that aren't lean mass hyperresponders. So let's talk about who those people are and how to kind of, weed them out. So there's familial, right? Predisposition to either hypertriglyceridemia or hypercholesterolemia.
Yes, hypertriglyceridemia being, of course, you have very high levels of triglyceride, and exactly what you described. If it's familial, I do want to throw out a little pet peeve. As an engineer, I have been a bit frustrated that the diagnosis even though we have the means to determine this genetically, they've sort of relaxed the diagnosis to where it doesn't have to be confirmed to be genetic. I think if you use FH or using familial hypertriglyceridemia, it should be confirmed that it's genetic. Otherwise,
you mean just testing, like actually testing for the gene, because we can do that now.
Exactly, right. Because, for example, I could induce hypercholesterolemia as I do with diet, but I know there's a lot of lean mass hyperresponders who get misdiagnosed as having FH. Like it's a misdiagnosis, but in my opinion, because now they've changed it to where it doesn't have to truly be genetic. You could just have, above a certain level and then have heart disease, and therefore you'll get that diagnosis. But I think it should get genetically confirmed, molecular, right? But to your point, high triglycerides are something I'm acutely aware of within my own friends and family. I kind of think of it as an excellent leading indicator towards poor metabolic health. Typically, triglycerides are one of the earliest things that can start going up. And I know right now the guidelines say that above 150 would be considered moderately hypertriglyceridemic. In my opinion, Jaime, I with my own family and friends, I want them all at 100 or lower. And to be fair, it is a noisy marker. So if you're listening to this and you've gotten a test and it's like 115, don't fret too much about it. It's more about whether it's a repeated level. But me personally, I want to see it at under 100. I think that we're too relaxed on what that number should be. But if you have a disease that results in hypertriglyceridemia, it's not surprising to see a lot of health issues that are associated with it, including things like xanthomas, that's like the deposits of cholesterol or fat around the body, and unfortunately, earlier cardiovascular disease.
You brought up a good point that these things can change a lot quicker than people really realize, and definitely something that should be trended over time. And you've done a lot of N-of-1 experiments where, you check it 1 hour and do something, intervention, and check it 12 hours later, and it's different. I had a follower recently that was commenting that they started a ketogenic diet and their triglycerides shot up. So over what period of time should people look at these or trend these, or what events in their life would make it not be interpreted, as a, do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. It's true. If you're looking at even just like 1% of the experiments that I've described that I've done, you should hopefully come away with at least, and I mean this in a good way, greater uncertainty as to how much a single lipid test can truly tell you. So because of how rapidly I can show that it can happen in a short span of time, on top of there being additional things that can be more determinate over the longer span of time, that alone should already, I hope, bring people to the realization that retesting should be something you should be very comfortable doing. So a couple of things on that note. One, I have seen, for example, when I went on a carnivore diet, my triglycerides were way up compared to where I thought that they were. And this became the basis for a series of readings that I did that I now call the triglyceride carryover experiment. And it's now kind of an effect that we refer to a lot from within the Facebook communities around cholesterol code. You could just do a search on cholesterolcode.com/triglyceride carryover. Basically, here's the gist of it. Triglyceride levels, when you have lower bolus and basal insulin, are not too surprising. And that's kind of a big deal because a lot of the current research is looking at not fasting triglycerides, as in you fasted, say, 12 hours, but they often look at postprandial triglyceride levels. Now, I believe right now, currently, that most of the people who are on, say, a very, very low carb diet, but otherwise moderate to higher fat, are going to see higher postprandial, that's post-meal, triglyceride levels, because there's less insulin activation relative to if you had more meals that were carbohydrate centric. But if you look at the fasted period, just like I did with my triglyceride carryover, you'll find that actually the fasted period, triglycerides are way back down again. And that's because I think that there's a longer residence time for triglycerides in the bloodstream for somebody who's on a very low carb diet, which modern science would say, oh, that's probably a bad sign. That means that you're at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. But the problem is that that's associated with people who are on a mixed diet. If you're on a mixed diet, again, it gets back to it likely is poor metabolic health if triglycerides aren't being put away when you're not really putting in that many triglycerides. And you are at higher insulin levels that should be putting those, not just the triglycerides, but also the glucose away. Conversely, though, if you're on a low carb diet, as I'm sure you know, physiologically, your body acts more on glucose levels than it does on fatty acids. Glucose is more of a top down, it's more of an endocrine action based systemic response, whereas fatty acids are more ground up, they're more distributed. This is why a software engineer like me loves it, because it's more of a distributed network. It's more like cloud computing, right? I like to joke that, sorry, this is more for the geeks, but I like to joke that the body was doing cloud ops long before we were, because it is. Fatty acids, you'll find the body doesn't act on them the same way that they do for glucose levels.
Okay, yeah. And so on your website, you talk too about ketones as an energy source versus fatty acids. And you were just kind of alluding to this too, with like glucose as an energy source. There definitely seems to be differences between like being zero carb, low carb, moderate carb. how does one determine like where they should fall? Is cholesterol testing helpful for that, or is it still just so individualized?
I'm not entirely sure that. Again, it kind of depends on whether or not it turns out that we're right with regard to risk coming out of these studies. But I think that a lot of us, when we're approaching the diet, and particularly when we find low carb, we're excited, we're experimenting a lot. And a lot of times where we think we're going to land on the long-term diet changes. I mean, there's almost nothing that changes as much as diet, which is to the frustration of epidemiologists, because often they want to pretend that there's these homogenous populations that are on this one diet for like 50 years and that they can extract data. But as you know, I mean, that's not realistic. A lot of times people, for example, I know a lot of people who have benefited greatly from the carnivore diet, and it's really been truly life-changing. And yet they still want to experiment with different things that they miss. So there are some things that, whether it's going to be on a once in a while basis or not, they want to check into it. And of those people who are doing it for that reason, there's also some people who are doing it strictly for the cholesterol reason. Maybe they're more okay with an LDL of, say, 180 or 200, but they're not okay with an LDL of 400 or 500. And again, I respect wherever somebody's at and whatever they want to do, but that might be a reason that they might take on more carbohydrates in particular, just to change the cholesterol levels. I know many people are like that. But at the same time, and I'm sure you may have some patients, I certainly know many who, it might as well be a peanut allergy. There are some like epileptics. There's just no chance. There's no way they can have any carbohydrates. And it's one of those things where for them, they're like, I just hope you get this research back soon, because I can't even experiment with having it at a higher level and my cholesterol levels are super high.
Yeah, I get patients that come in and they're like, I feel amazing. I used to have high blood pressure. I used to have XYZ disease. And through this lifestyle, I have, put that into remission and so it's hard what to know, what to say, because we do see these lipid changes. But for me, I think it always has to be in context of looking at other metabolic markers, and what you're doing will be so important. If somebody, Dave, is just starting, to make some dietary changes, they were like you or I, got diagnosed with prediabetes, they're initiating ketogenic or diet. How soon after initiation should they pursue testing? Like, what does that window look like as far as how quickly or slowly things change?
Me personally, particularly if you're wanting to look at lipids, I strongly recommend waiting until you're weight stable. Because at the point at which while you're losing weight, you are necessarily releasing more from your adipocytes. It's literally their job. Their job is to provide as you're on your way down. And therefore, not only do I expect that you're going to be more likely to have higher ApoB containing lipoproteins, but you also may have higher triglycerides, which could be more concerning. However, it isn't when you think about it in terms of that's literally what the lipid droplets are inside of those adipocytes. They're triglycerides. They're the storage form. There's going to be more that are released, and there's more that are going to be recirculated.
Breaking down your fat and liberating it into your bloodstream.
Exactly. Yeah. And so until you're weight stable, you're not going to get a fairly good idea. But while on this subject, also, whenever you get a blood test, try to hold to your staples. This is another thing. If you're following my research, you know just how much lipids, and really, I get a wide spectrum blood test, so I can tell you lots of things change based on what you've been eating or doing in the last few days. So ideally, if your buddy's in from out of town, you're not doing shots from 2 days before or whatever else could be perturbing it. But you won't think of those things unless it's already in your mind to prepare. So I, for one, whenever I know anybody who's going to be getting a blood test, I'm like, hey, for the 3 to 5 days, preferably 5 days beforehand, try to live your usual life, your mean average life, right? As far as food and anything else you do, just so that you don't change those values too much, especially if you don't get them very often.
Yeah, I think that's super important for everybody listening. Just one more time, keep all the variables as constant as you can. If you're doing repeated testing and looking at something over time, we have a DEXA scanner, for instance, at our facility. And, you know, if you did a HIIT workout and then jumped in there, if you were dehydrated, or even on like bioelectrical impedance, if a woman's menstruating, like things can change. So try to keep all variables constant. And when you were saying about the transient changes with triglycerides during weight loss, this is what patients will say. They're like, I went to my primary care. I told them I lost 50 pounds. They were so excited. Then they called me the next day and were screaming at me about my cholesterol. They're like, what gives? So I think that's important advice too, is make sure weight is stable, variables are stable, you know, when you're looking at these things over time. Well, Dave, tell people kind of the specifics of the lean mass hyperresponder research that you're doing. Are you still recruiting subjects? How do people find that information or enroll or whatever?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity for the plug. We are still doing the study. We're still recruiting for it. It's out of Lundquist at UCLA. Here's the gist. Basically, participants, if you qualify, the main cut points are a little more relaxed than the lean mass hyperresponder cut points I mentioned earlier. Basically, you have to have an LDL of 160 or below before having gone on the diet. Has to increase to at least 190 and above. And whatever that distance is between the two, that it's 50% or more. So if you saw at least a 50% increase in your LDL going on a low carb or carnivore diet, then you may qualify. HDL of 60 or higher, and triglycerides of 80 or below, and that you've been on the current diet for at least 2 or more years. What we do is we fly participants there. They will get a high resolution CT angiogram along with wide spectrum blood work, along with genetic testing, and you get all this data back for free. We pay for you to go there, stay overnight in a hotel so that you're well rested, and then we fly you back. And then 1 year later, you fly back and repeat all of that again. That way we can actually capture progression of plaque. And we're so excited. We've already gotten quite a lot of participants that have jumped in on this, but it's a crucial study. You have to recognize it's the first of its kind in so many different ways. For one, we just don't study healthy populations. It's a pet peeve of mine that so much of this research is extrapolated from populations that are not as metabolically healthy. But on top of that, when you think about it on paper, technically, the participants that are on these diets are more likely to be ticking all of the boxes of what dietitians would say are the wrong thing. Often lots of red meat, often lots of animal protein, often low in vegetables and so forth. So ironically, in a roundabout way, any of these might be confounders to just the high LDL, or in a roundabout way, we're kind of getting them all in one shot, one big basket of all of these different aspects alongside really high LDL. Will we see advanced cardiovascular disease? I don't know until we're actually getting the data, but that's what we're in the process of doing.
Fascinating.
Oh, sorry, to the website.
Tell them where to go, like the website.
Yeah, go to lmhrstudy.com. It'll take you to our dedicated page at the Citizen Science Foundation.
lmhrstudy.com.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, wonderful. And then tell people how to find your website too, because a lot of what you do really is advocacy work, essentially in this space. So I want people to be able to support your work and what you're doing.
Sure. Well, of course, I just mentioned citizensciencefoundation.org. We also have cholesterolcode.com. And for what it's worth, if anybody else wants to contribute via Citizen Science, we also have ownyourlabs.com, which we basically line people up with. If they want to order private blood testing, they can get it through there as well. But we incentivize them by giving them 10% off to contribute their data to our anonymized data pool, so that we can open that gate more towards both formal and citizen researchers alike, because that's another pet peeve of mine, is that there's not more open data, particularly in our cohort. Like, there just should be more that we can use for analysis. So
I love it. And Dave's having me do a little N of 1 experiment. I'm going to sit on my butt for a while and not do resistance training. And we're going to see what happens with my lipids and cholesterol. So, and Dave has done tons of N of 1 experiments, and you can go to his website and find those. Plus he's got these really cool animation cartoon videos on cholesterol. When you hear him talk about these boats and carriers, he's got some great visuals on there. So go check out that website if it sounded completely like foreign language, what we talked about today. It will make more sense if you have a visual. Okay, so at the end of the podcast, we do the semen analysis, and Dave and I are obviously huge fans of low carb and ketogenic therapies for a variety of reasons. But I pulled this study from the Annals of Internal Medicine back in 2004, comparing low carbohydrate diets with low fat diets to treat obesity and hyperlipidemia, because that's really kind of the core of what we're talking about here, is how do we make people metabolically healthy. This was a randomized control trial. It had 120 overweight people that all were hyperlipidemic. And the low carb intervention group had less than 20 grams of carbs daily, plus a nutritional supplement. They had an exercise recommendation, group meetings, and then the low fat diet had less than 30% energy from fat, less than 300 milligrams of cholesterol daily. And they were put into a deficit of 500 to 1,000 calories per day, plus of course their exercise. But they looked at body weight, body composition, fasting serum lipid levels, and then the tolerability of the diet, which a lot of people argue that low carb isn't sustainable. I would argue otherwise. I've been doing it since 2015, 2016. I think Dave about the same amount of time. And there's definitely people that have done it a lot longer than we have. And in this study group of 120 people, there was actually better adherence in the low carb group compared to the low fat group. They followed these people over 24 weeks, and the weight loss was actually greater for the low carb group as well. Patients in both groups did lose a substantial amount of fat mass. And then compared with the recipients of the low fat diet, the low carb diet had a greater decrease in serum triglyceride levels, which is what, Dave and I have kind of described, and a greater increase in their high density lipoprotein cholesterol. So an improvement in that triglyceride to HDL ratio. Changes in LDL actually didn't really differ statistically between the two groups, which I thought was interesting. And so I think that's, what Dave is trying to figure out for all of us. There's certainly limitations with all studies, but if you guys want to go check that out, Yancey was the lead author on that paper. So Dave, any last thoughts for our listeners?
No, I did want to capitalize. There was one thing that you'd mentioned from a little earlier that I really do try to drive home, at least as far as my own opinion. And while this isn't medical advice, I really feel like there's just no comparison to the actual detection of disease, regardless of whatever blood markers you're looking at, whether it's lipids or anything. The actual, like getting a CT angiogram or getting a CAC, and a CAC is just super widely available at this point, is literally looking at the disease. I'm always going to consider that to be the most relevant thing to look to when trying to consider where you really stand on risk. And I will just mention one other study, which was with the Danish group. I can't remember who the lead author is right offhand, but it had 23,000 participants, and these were symptomatic folks out of Denmark. So basically, if you had chest pains or something like that, and you got referred to for a CT angiogram, this was that data between, I want to say, 2008 and 2017. And they looked across all sorts of things with lipids and so forth, but they found nothing was nearly as prognostically powerful as the actual disease presence itself for what future events are, which you might think, well, duh, right? But it is fascinating because oftentimes people treat blood markers as the disease itself. And if you watch my research, you know just how fast these things can change and how much we're still learning about it. But there's no comparator to the disease itself. So for anybody who's watching this and who's considering how much we should try to read the tea leaves on these blood markers, I always, as with my family, always point to a direction of just consider getting a scan and looking for yourself and finding out. I'm glad you do a lot of these checks with your patients, as you mentioned, like including carotid and intima media thickness tests, because you're looking for exactly that. So that's just the last thought I want to leave it with.
Yeah, and they're really not expensive tests. In most places you can get a coronary artery calcium scan for $100, $150. There's places where you don't even need a doctor's order. You can just go in and ask for a scan. Same with the CIMT, or carotid intima media thickness. There's also some new scans, Dave. I don't know if you have any experience with them, but some people will argue with the CAC that you're only looking for calcified plaques, which are actually a little bit more stable and less risk than a soft plaque. There's these new Clearly scans that are looking at soft atherogenic plaques. Do you have any experience with that with your work?
Not with that one, but a CT angiogram. So just for some comparison for people, usually radiation is where the concern is, and that's understandable given that prior machines used a lot of radiation, but we've had so much advancement just in the last 5 years. A CAC is about 0.6 millisieverts. And as I'm sure you know, Jaime, a mammogram, I believe, is 0.4 millisieverts. So it's about 1.5 of a mammogram. But I myself, I got a CT angiogram that was just 2 millisieverts, from a few months ago. And last year, a few months ago. But the 2 millisieverts, a year of regular life, just walking around, living life as normal, is already like 3.5 millisieverts. So it's already like half of what you'd be getting just like living life normally in a given year. And it's extremely small, but exactly what you just described. With a CT angiogram, you can see both non-calcified and calcified plaque, both soft plaque and calcified plaque. It's like the geography of your heart. And it's why we're using it for the LMHR study. The Clearly one I haven't heard about yet, but I would be interested to check it out at some point. Regardless, again, looking at disease. Yeah. But regardless, looking at disease, I still think literally the presence of the atherosclerotic plaque in your arteries, you just can't beat that. That's actually seeing where your risk is probably lying.
Yeah. And change over time, because sometimes people are, okay, I'm metabolically healthy. They make these changes and you go look and you're like, well, there's plaque there. Well, was it from the last 5 years of your new healthy ketogenic diet, or was it from the first 40 years of you treating your body like garbage? So that's why, get testing, trend it over time, keep variables the same as much as you can. So yeah, great advice. Well, thank you, Dave, so much. Thanks for everybody for listening in. Please share this, especially if you're living low carb ketogenic diet, there's going to be somebody in your circle that could be what we call this lean mass hyperresponder. And if you're interested in finding out if you qualify for Dave's study to help further the science and the knowledge, go to LMHRstudy.com. Did I say that right? Okay, LMHRstudy.com, and go check out Dave's website. And appreciate your time, Dave.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jaime.
Have a good day, everybody.